welcome everybody. And let me turn it to you, Chair Borenstein, to provide your opening remarks, and then I can do our roll call and we'll do the whole dance.
Okay. Welcome everyone. And I'm not sure I have much to add since we've already welcomed. But we have again, a fairly short agenda today, but one important decisional item. And I look forward to hearing the update from Elliot.
All right, great. Well, we all feel very welcome, and let me do our roll call, which is Chair Borenstein.
Here.
Vice Chair Edo.
Here.
Governor Galetova.
Present.
Governor Leslie.
Here.
And Governor Shorey.
Here.
We have present, here, and all accounted for. So we can move forward, and we have our quorum. And I'll turn it back to you, Chair Borenstein, to keep us rolling.
I think the next thing is the approval of the draft minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually the general public comment. And so while we hand it over to...
Yeah, I keep skipping over that. I'm looking at the wrong guy.
Yeah, that's okay. We oftentimes don't get any, so it's easy to forget it. But but we do have that. So Silas, if you can open the phone lines for any general public comment for items not on the board meeting agenda today.
If you would like to speak under general public comment, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or if you are dialed in through the phone line, you may press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the comment queue. At this time, I'm not seeing any hands up in our comment queue.
Okay, then we move ahead to the decision on the general session minutes.
We do.
There we go.
So if I can have a motion to approve the December 19th, 2024 general session minutes for the ISO Board of Governors.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, board members. The motion passes. And with that, I can turn it back to you, Chair Borenstein, or turn it over to Elliot.
Let's turn it over to Elliot.
All right, let's do that.
Well,
we're efficient today.
Thank you, Chair Borenstein and members of the Board of Governors. It's wonderful to see all of you. Because we do have a relatively light agenda today, and because we have a lot of substantive work going on, I'm going to work through quite a bit of detail on my CEO report today. I just thought it'd be nice just to really give everybody focused on a lot of, I think, critical activities that are going on at the moment. Of course, much of our focus in 2025 is going to continue to be on implementation of our key initiatives, including, of course, the extended day-ahead market, as well as our interconnection process reforms. And so there's a lot of head-down focus at this time. In this report, I'm going to be providing updates on both of those activities, as well as the work we're doing on summer readiness, Senate Bill 540 and the West-Wide Governance Pathways Initiative, the reorganization that has recently taken place in our control center, as well as FERC's approval for the ISO's proposed process for administering the EDAM access charge in our balancing authority area. I'm going to start out with the EDAM update as we continue moving forward with the launch of EDAM next spring with PacifiCorp and then Portland General Electric in the fall as our initial market participants. We've also been engaged with a good deal of additional EDAM related activity. In February, PacifiCorp, which has a fully executed and signed implementation agreement to join EDAM when it launches in 2026, filed with FERC its proposed open access transmission tariff revisions implementing the extended day-ahead market. And one of the clear themes from commenters centered on some concerns regarding the ability to hedge congestion cost exposure associated with the exercise of their OAT rights and how EDAM allocates congestion revenues to participating balancing areas, which are then, of course, sub-allocated to transmission customers. The CAISO filed an answer in the pending PacifiCorp EDAM tariff proceeding on March 7th. And in that filing, I think we very clearly asserted our belief that the PacifiCorp tariff provisions for the suballocation of received congestion revenues are just and reasonable. They, of course, have been fully approved by the Commission. On the question of how congestion revenues are allocated between EDAM balancing areas, particularly congestion revenues that are arising as a result of parallel flow between interconnected and adjacent EDAM areas, we have agreed to engage in an expedited stakeholder initiative to further describe the FERC-approved EDAM design and to consider potential transitional alternatives and associated trade-offs. We published an issue paper back on March 17th, and earlier this week held what I thought was a very substantive and very constructive conversation with stakeholders about this set of issues. Really appreciated everybody who participated in that conversation and offered their views. And we now will have a comment period on that initial issue paper over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then our hope is that we will be able to bring stakeholders together in relatively short order around a recommendation to the Board of Governors and the WM governing body at the joint session in May. So a lot of work there. Again, I think this was an important set of topics. These are transitional issues. We're changing the design. We're seeing, I think, the physics of parallel flow meet economics, and we want to just make sure that we have everybody on the same page to the maximum extent possible. Also, I just wanted to note, as in my CEO report, that certainly I think many of us are aware now that the Bonneville Power Administration on March 5th issued its day-ahead market draft policy direction, stating that Bonneville should select the Southwest Power Pools Markets Plus as its preferred choice for participation in an extended day-ahead market. I think the policy direction that was released by BPA was still in a draft form, with a final decision scheduled for May, following a 30-day comment period, which is currently underway. I certainly note, and obviously with my background, that Bonneville has been a valued and long-standing partner for the ISO, and Bonneville played, I think, a really key role in the early days of making the Western Energy Imbalance Market a major success for electricity customers in the Northwest and across the West. And I've said publicly, certainly we respect Bonneville's decision-making process, and we'll look forward to continue to work together through Bonneville's ongoing participation in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. I think our view, as we've stated in a number of forums, is that Bonneville's final market decision is going to have major impacts on reliability and affordability for electricity customers in the Northwest and across the West. And we'll continue to encourage Bonneville to continue to evaluate EDAM and to engage in the Pathways Initiative, which I think is extremely responsive to their concerns about governance, while that legislation works its way through the California legislature. Of course, at the end of the day, irrespective of how Bonneville ultimately chooses to proceed, we are going to maintain our focus and momentum on EDAM implementation and providing technical support to the Pathways Initiative. And I just want to say, on behalf of all the people who've worked with the CAISO over the last several years to develop EDAM, all the folks at staff, all of the folks, our many, many partners, we're just very proud of the fact that the EDAM design was crafted through an extensive and transparent process with a wide variety of stakeholders being fully approved by FERC last year. So we're going to keep our head down, keep working on our many partnerships, and continue making progress. On another very important area for the ISO regarding interconnection process reforms, our reform efforts continue with track 3 of the interconnection process enhancements, which will of course be presented to the Board of Governors for the decision later today. These enhancements seek to prioritize resources for interconnection in a timely and efficient manner, building on our ongoing work towards alignment of planning, procurement, and interconnection processes. That synchronization is so critical to onboarding resources in California. At the same time, I wanted to note that our implementation of the Track 2 reforms, which went into effect last fall, is proceeding well. We're moving forward with validating and preparing to study the Cluster 15 projects that advanced through the new interconnection request intake process over the winter. And here's a few of the numbers. As a result of the Track 2 reforms, the ISO is going to end up studying 177 projects comprising more than 96,000 megawatts of total capacity. And still a lot of that's a large number of projects to study, but this actually constitutes a 67% reduction in the number of projects and a 72% reduction in the capacity of the projects in Cluster 15 since the initial application window opened in 2023. I wanted to note that the scoring and tiebreaker analysis was actually sufficient this time around to select projects without needing to conduct any auctions. And the ISO is working now to develop a comprehensive report of the Cluster 15 process to share with stakeholders in FERC in June, which will also provide key takeaways for exploring any necessary procedural modifications, and will then, of course, commence a new interconnection process enhancements initiative later this year to consider any necessary or appropriate adjustments to the process prior to Cluster 16, which will open in October of 2026. And so the right sizing of the study process, really identifying those projects that have the best attributes that are lined up with deliverability or future transmission development, and seem to be aligned with the needs of our load serving entities in the state with their resource adequacy obligations. That appears to be moving in the right direction, but we will be closely monitoring it, looking forward to making any adjustments as necessary. Of course, we're now here almost with March behind us, spring breaking out, and that means summer is right around the corner, just about 3 months away, and we're again focused on our annual summer readiness activities. The RC West is busy working with transmission operators and balancing authorities to coordinate all the spring maintenance that typically gets done this time of year in advance of summer. And our summer loads and resource assessment is going to be published in May. And we are again heading into summer, I think, in better shape than a year ago, with significant new resources onboarded. Just again, the numbers from March 1st, 2024 through February 28th, 2025, another 7,000 megawatts of additional capacity was brought online. And that brings the amount of new resources onboarded since the beginning of 2020 to 26,290 megawatts, a reflection of the strong collaborative effort by the ISO, the state, and our many partners and stakeholders to strengthen the grid and boost overall reliability. I quote those numbers, and I just want folks to reflect on them, just to really remember just how seriously and how focused on resource adequacy improvements we've been here in California. And this synchronization of planning and interconnection and queuing and the efficient onboarding of new resources has just made a major difference. So we certainly have our work cut out for us and continue our progress. But I think it's important to note just how far the state has come in the last 4 to 5 years in fortifying its grid and being able to ride through extreme weather events. For 2025, of course, we're going to be taking a similar approach to last summer's readiness activities and training by offering more comprehensive refresher sessions for our market participants. And this year's training is going to cover operational actions related to unit response and performance, managing intertie transactions, export priorities, wheel-through transactions, and emergency assistance protocols and communications. And various summer readiness training sessions are going to be offered throughout May with key audiences identified for each session. So our folks in our stakeholder affairs group have really beefed up our training activities. We're going to be taking advantage of our new facilities on the first floor of the Folsom facility and just making sure that everybody is as ready as possible. Then, of course, as we've done over the last several years, we're going to begin hosting our summer readiness leadership roundtable, engaging with leadership from our neighboring balancing authority areas, entities in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and utilities within California and across the West to discuss the forecasted outlook for summer operations. And I think this event, which we're going to carry forward, really provides everyone participating an opportunity to highlight key areas for awareness, coordination, and communication. This will be the 5th consecutive year for the roundtable, which is scheduled for May 7th. Of course, all of us recognize how important it is to be supporting each other in summer and looking out for each other for preserving reliability for the broader system. I want to turn just for a few minutes now to the Westwide Governance Pathways Initiative. I think we were all pleased to see a bill introduced in the California legislature on February 20th that would authorize establishment of an independent regional organization to govern the energy markets throughout the West. Obviously a product of a tremendous amount of work, the Pathways Initiative. Senate Bill 540 is sponsored by Senator Josh Becker, the Democrat of Menlo Park, who is the chair of the Senate Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications, and also by Senator Henry Stern from Los Angeles. This bill is the result of extensive collaboration by regulators and stakeholders around the West, as well as significant technical input by the ISO. Back on March 12th, I took part in an informational hearing on the Pathways Initiative before Senator Becker's committee with Alice Reynolds, President of the California Public Utilities Commission, and Siva Gunda, the Vice Chair of the California Energy Commission. And we will, of course, continue to engage with the Pathways Formation Committee and the legislature if needed. Of course, if SB 540 passes and becomes law, and if our Board of Governors finds that certain requirements are met as required in the proposed legislation, the new regional organization would provide independent governance over the energy markets that are currently operated by the California ISO, and the ISO would maintain its responsibilities as balancing authority in California, and the state would retain control over public policies for California's energy planning, resource procurement, and the renewables portfolio standard. I think that ability to simultaneously bring the energy markets under independent governance and to allow for California and, of course, the other states across the West to preserve those jurisdictional responsibilities that they hold dearly, I think is really key to the success of this proposal, and we will certainly stand prepared to continue providing technical input and support as necessary. One other thing I wanted to note, which I think is important for folks to recognize, is that we've recently undertaken a grid operations and infrastructure operations planning reorganization within the CAISO. And this is intended to provide even greater assurance to all of our market participants about our ability to functionally separate our roles as a balancing authority operator and our roles as a market operator for the broader region. So the reorganization that was announced internally last November within our grid operations and infrastructure operations planning teams took effect actually on February 24th. And all indications are that the transition is going well and has been favorably received by the affected team members and I think by our customers who have been exposed to it. The reorganization was undertaken primarily to achieve physical and functional separation to more accurately represent the distinct roles of market operators and balancing authority operations. And these moves also underscore our longstanding commitment to treating all market participants impartially while maintaining high quality service in performing our responsibilities as California's largest balancing authority. And I want to reiterate, of course, as the independent system operator, we are not a market participant. We've never been a market participant in California, nor will we ever be a market participant in the broader emerging Western energy markets. Under the reorganization, just make sure understand that the personalities, market operations now reports directly to John Phipps, our Executive Director of Grid Operations. The Operations Engineering Service team is now under Grid Operations, and we've combined Operations Engineering Services and Reliability Coordination. They now report to Raja Thepadabula, who is in the newly created position of Director, RC West Operations. We've also hired 2 managers of reliability coordination who have complete oversight responsibility for reliability coordinators who now report directly to the Director of RC West Operations. As the power grid and the tools to monitor it have grown in complexity, the operations engineer and reliability coordinator teams do work more closely together when performing their tasks. I think combining these teams allowed us to strengthen the efficiencies and synergies in our processes. And we also created something I'm really excited about, a new grid user support team that will report directly to Tricia Johnstone, the ISO's Director of Operational Readiness. And I think at the end of the day, by separating market operations from balancing area operations, both in reporting and in the physical configuration at our headquarters in Folsom, we're better positioned for future success and transparency and assurance as our regional markets continue to grow and attract additional participants. So just want to make sure everybody was fully aware that that change had been underway. And of course, as we'll continue to work with our partners and others through the Pathways process to further evolve these functions. Finally, I wanted to just note briefly that on February 20th, FERC did approve the final component of the tariff revisions that enabled the ISO's day one participation in EDAM. And this approval affirms the manner in which the ISO will administer the EDAM access charge in its own balancing authority and supplements FERC's earlier approval of the ISO's initial day one components. So was pleased to see the advancement for another year. Ben Hobbs earlier today And just wanted to hope you appreciate I'm just very honestly, just very proud right now. There's a lot happening in our operating environment. There's a lot happening in the West, but I just could not be more grateful for our many partnerships, the level of support we've experienced for EDAM in many quarters, and just excited to keep our head down and focus on implementation of these key initiatives here across 2025 and into 2026. So thank you very much, and be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Elliot. I have one question actually.
Yes.
There's no question we're going to see load growth. Have we started to see it already when we do the adjustments for weather and so forth? What does it look like now from electrification? And I mean, we can't pin it down probably the cause yet, but and data centers and so forth.
Yeah, we're starting to see a little bit of it show up. Honestly, I think when you look at the CEC's load forecasts, the inflection point, particularly around data centers, is right around 2028 when things start to really kick in. So I think the area that we've really been probably making the most progress just to stay ahead of the curve is on the transmission side. As you know, for the data center loads, we are reinforcing the transmission system in the Silicon Valley. We're about to come out with another draft transmission plan for the next 10 years. And so we're going to continue to update that. But I think that the escalation point starts to kick in really about 2028. And we are looking at significant load growth based off electrification and fuel switching going out to 2035. So those numbers you'll see the very, very latest reflected in our transmission plan, which will hit the street in the next several days. But I feel like we're on top of it.
No, but for as far as this summer goes, I still remember
for this summer,
yeah, where it would sort of CAISO got surprised a bit by the amount of air conditioning that had been installed. And
yeah, well, we're gonna within the next few weeks we'll come out with our very, very, very latest look on our summer readiness numbers. Neil and the team are crunching those, so I don't want to get ahead of that. But I think generally, as with last summer, although we continue to encourage the state to continue its progress on building out its planning reserve margin and doing its fortification, we're feeling in pretty good shape for this summer again, based off another round of resource additions over the last several months.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions, or we can move on to Rob Kondziolka.
See, you gotta leave this to the professionals. That's Chair Kondziolka.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry, Rob.
So Chair Board, Steve, Vice Chair Edo, Board of Governors. Yep, Rob Kondziolka back. I hung out on the line and didn't check back in. As you're aware, we had the general session for the governing body yesterday. In addition to our normal agenda items, we had a focus on the subject that Elliot just touched on, which is the transmission rights and congestion for participants outside of the California ISO BAA. And that consisted of a detailed education session by staff, and they provided us an update on the initiative and the workshop that was held on Monday, again, that Elliot mentioned. We also had briefings from PacifiCorp and from Portland General Electric on their OAT tariff filings. Mike Wilding of PacifiCorp kind of gave us a really detailed overview of what they've gone through, and we all owe PacifiCorp a huge bit of gratitude for all they have been going through and what they are going through. Being the first makes it tough. Any issue that is going to be raised is being raised with them. And I think that some good things, or even though you may have heard other things, some really good things have come out of this is much greater appreciation for some details that may not have been understood. And this is where I think education and communication on details is really important. And I'll get back to that at the end. When Portland General provided their update on their tariff filing, really good news here. They believe they're going to file by the end of the week. And you know, again, something might come up, but they are there. So you're hearing a lot of noise, and they have looked at the tariff filing that PacifiCorp has made, and the term they use, and I really appreciate this, they are looking at the language incorporated into the PacifiCorp tariff that is submitted as somewhat of a pro forma. And so I think that as we see Portland General submit their tariff, and then we see subsequent EDAM participants submit their tariffs, they're looking at using as much of the exact same language as being used. So issues that are being debated don't have to be continually debated over and over again. And I think that's really positive. There's a lot of nuances in this issue. Elliot touched on it, so I won't go through it again. We all have some very strong feelings on this issue, and I think there are some real learnings that can be incorporated from the Western Interconnection on how they have dealt with congestion, and typically in the point-to-point world, you know, I'll just say it'll really take a look at how unscheduled flow is addressed or mitigated. And so that part, I think, is coming to light. So one of the outcomes that we have in hearing all this is we are moving forward in asking our market expert, who is Susan Pope, to put on a general session for us. So it'll be an educational information session in April. We are fast tracking this so we can get input from her before the May decision comes up. I will do what I need to make certain that as soon as any of these details are put into place, that one, you have the meeting information, and two, you get her material as soon as it is available. And so it may be as soon as 2 weeks, it may be 3 weeks. We're just working on logistics right now. We started that yesterday. And we are not asking her to comment specifically on PacifiCorp's issues, the protest. We're not asking, Portland General. We're not asking her to address specifics that CAISO staff is looking into. We're asking her to look at this subject, and she has over 25 years of detailed experience on transmission rights and congestion in other parts of the country and in the West. And we're asking her to look at this from a experience perspective, a principles perspective, and a economics philosophical perspective, so that we understand this as we move forward. We think there's a lot of value to be gained by this. And so we really want to make certain that we hear this as we move forward, and we don't want to impinge. We're not asking her to impinge at all on what staff is doing in their initiative. So don't think of it as something that's part of the initiative. It's separate from that process. So enough said. I'll stop, and we can take any questions and then move on. Severin, I'm not hearing anything.
That's
looks like
my
Mary.
fault. I was muted. Looks like we have a couple of questions. Mary. You're muted, Mary.
Rob, this is not a question for you, but thank you for the update you just gave. I just wanted to harken back to Elliot's report. Elliot, I just want to say that I echo your feelings and appreciation and proud feelings towards the CAISO staff, because what I think they've achieved in this report, though you did bury it in summer readiness, is that this remarkable resource onboarding. Okay, 26 gigawatts since 2020 and 7 gigawatts since 2024. Okay, and that was in, I think, 8 or 9 months in 2024. So I just want to say thank you very much, and can you keep it up? Because I think this is one of the most important indicators we have of how well we're going to do moving forward, is our ability to integrate this power. and this new clean power. And, you know, I live in Los Angeles, so I've unfortunately experienced what just happened here. And even though I don't think this necessarily has anything to do with that, I do think the more resilient we are and the more clean power we bring on board, the better off we're going to be. So I'm just making a statement, thanking you and the ISO staff.
Thank you, Mary, on behalf of us. And I would say also back to Rob. Rob, your work in helping us advance the EIM and now with EDAM, it's certainly for all those resources that are coming on board, both here in California and in other places, whether they're generators or transmission. I think we're going to help really dispatch them as efficiently as possible, especially at a time when reliability and affordability are so important to customers. So thank you for your report out as well. And Chair Bornstein, I'll pass it back to you.
I'll pass it over to Joe.
Thanks. My thanks are to Rob specifically for the bringing Susan Pope's work forward into a more public form. I think more education on this topic is going to help all of us. And I appreciate your clarifying the general nature of what her comments will speak to as opposed to the specifics of maybe what Pacific Core or PG&E have already spoken about. I'm looking forward to that. And thank you again for making that available. I know it's going to be an agenda item for us soon, so I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Rob. Thanks for checking in with us. That's great.
Thank you.
And next we are moving on to the decisional item.
Yes, we have our decision on interconnection process enhancements, track 3. And before we turn it over to Anna, who's going to introduce the topic. Is that correct? It's Anna today?
No, it'll
Sorry,
be Neil.
Today it's Neil. Yeah.
Well, you know, you guys look so much alike. But before we do that, Neil, sorry about that. I had an error on my notes. We have 2 public comment letters that I want to note for the record that have been provided to the board. And that's one received by California Community Choice Association and one from Large Scale Solar Association. And both of those letters have been provided to the board. I wanted to note those for the record. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Roger. No problem about the identification. I'm fine with it, but Anna might have words with you later.
You've probably been called worse things, so right.
Anyway, so let me dive right in here. First off, yes, thank you for the introduction. And today I will be asking Danielle Mills, our Principal of Infrastructure Policy Development, to actually present the decision item on track 3 of our interconnection process enhancements effort. You will recall, or you may recall, that when Danielle presented in June last year, the track 2 transformative changes that Elliot referred to that were approved by FERC in September, we had identified at that time that there were several other items that needed to be addressed, but were best addressed after the track 2 reforms were approved. So that is what we will be bringing, or Danielle will be bringing to you here today. I do want to thank Danielle and the rest of the ISO team for their efforts continuing to press forward with these additional refinements. And I also want to thank our stakeholders for continuing to actively participate in the stakeholder process and supporting the effort that produced the results today. So with that, I will turn it over to Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and good afternoon, Chair and Governors. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, seeking your approval of track 3 of our interconnection process enhancements initiative. And as Neil and Elliot both mentioned, these changes build on the ISO's recent interconnection reform efforts. They are the next phase, but probably not the last phase of the interconnection process enhancements. So we really appreciate your continued engagement in these issues. Next slide, please. So during track 2 discussions around interconnection process enhancements, the importance of deliverability became very apparent to the ISO and to stakeholders. Just to kind of start at a high level, deliverability is needed for resource adequacy. There's only so much deliverability on the system to ensure that resources can physically deliver to the system during stressed system conditions. And so this set of reforms ensures accelerated onboarding of projects within clusters using the amount of interconnection capacity that currently exists on the system. We're also proposing modifications to streamline the deliverability allocation process and some additional transparency with stakeholders regarding designations of long lead time generation and storage resources for which the ISO reserves deliverability. Next slide, please. So the first kind of element of this set of reforms is intra-cluster prioritization. And this process, you may recall that cluster 14 was sort of where we started to see really increasing amounts of interconnection requests and interest in interconnecting. But track 2 didn't actually directly impact cluster 14. So we still have a very large set of interconnection requests in the queue as part of cluster 14. And when those cluster 14 phase 2 reports were completed, they identified several long lead time short circuit mitigation projects and reliability network upgrades. These are not to be confused with long lead time generation and storage projects. Right now, for intra-cluster prioritization, we're talking about long lead time reliability and network upgrades. But because of these long lead times for network upgrades that we're seeing in cluster 14, the current in-service dates for generation projects reflect a long amount of time to complete the long lead time reliability upgrades. And that means that those resources in cluster 14, many of them will not be able to come online until those long lead time reliability network upgrades are complete. There's a potential for some mitigation projects and network upgrades to be eliminated as generation and storage projects withdraw from the queue. So there is potential for some of those timelines to shorten. But if you go to the next slide, we are looking for ways to enable earlier interconnection of certain resources up to the amount of available interconnection capacity. Next slide, please. So intra-cluster prioritization will enable earlier interconnection of some projects in the cluster by allowing certain resources that are triggered within the cluster that are triggering long lead time network upgrades to interconnect up to the amount of capacity that then does trigger the need for that long lead time reliability network upgrade. So to determine which projects can take advantage of this process and the available capacity and headroom in the system currently, we'll use a process similar to what we use now for the deliverability allocation process. Next slide, please. So in terms of eligibility, while we had cluster 14 in mind when we developed this proposal, this process enhancement would be available to all cluster groups at the ISO right now. We're thinking about it in terms of cluster 14 certainly, but it could be applied to earlier clusters as well. And to determine eligibility, the ISO and participating transmission owners will work together and look at all reliability network upgrades that have either an estimated time to construct of 4 or more years and that delay the in-service date of multiple generation projects by 2 or more years. So this is our way of really identifying those longest lead time reliability network upgrades that have hopefully the most headroom under them where we can interconnect the greatest number of projects and get new capacity on the system. Reliability network upgrades to be considered would be, as I said, identified by the ISO working with participating transmission owners, and then we would post them on the ISO website. Next slide, please. So after we post the network upgrades that are eligible for this intra-cluster prioritization process, affected interconnection customers will submit forms with similar information to the forms that are currently submitted for the deliverability allocation process. The ISO will then rank those projects and provide those rankings to the participating transmission owners. And scores will be based on the status of project financing or PPA status, permitting, generator interconnection agreements, deliverability allocations, and deliverability network upgrade status. At that point, transmission owners will assess the potential projects that can benefit from this, allowing the highest ranking projects to come online prior to completion of the upgrades. Next slide, please. I just want to note that this is all intended to work within the current timeframes that we're seeing within each cluster. So the intent here is to expedite some projects, some generation and storage projects faster than they would otherwise be able to come online. But we're not talking about delaying any of the reliability network upgrade projects. Those would still continue to move forward. There's a possibility, as I mentioned before, that some of those projects may no longer be necessary if some projects withdraw. But if that doesn't occur, then we would still keep those reliability network upgrades moving on the same time frame that they're currently in place for. And then we're also not proposing any changes to the cost responsibility for the upgrades. That would not be affected by the process either. Next slide, please. So the second element of this interconnection process enhancement initiative track is consolidation and really modifications to how we allocate deliverability across the board. The first kind of biggest piece of this reform is that we would be consolidating the number of allocation groups to prioritize projects with power purchase agreements. So currently the ISO has 4 allocation groups: Group A, which is projects with executed power purchase agreements; Group B, which are projects that are actively negotiating toward a PPA or on a short list; Group C is for projects under commercial operation that are seeking deliverability; and Group D is all others, and it has several conditions to ensure that those Group D projects continue to move forward. What we're moving to is, though it's 3 allocation groups, it's essentially going to be more of a 2-step process where it's very binary. If you have a PPA, your first priority for deliverability. The second allocation group is the commercial operation group. This is really only going to be eligible to energy-only projects that were from Cluster 14 and prior. And this gives those energy-only projects an opportunity to come online and get deliverability, but they can only get that deliverability once they're operating. So they would be given second priority under this new reform. And then the third group that we propose is just a catch-all conditional group for all others with no conditions. So really this essentially provides a 2-step retention process and maximizes the amount of capacity that's going to be competing for power purchase agreements and therefore competing for deliverability, putting the procurement process really as the main driver for the allocation process and the main area that we're prioritizing for allocating deliverability. Next slide, please. We did have to make some a series of modifications and clarifications about how Cluster 14 and prior projects will operate under the current groups. Since this is quite a transition, we have so many projects in the current queue right now that haven't come in under the new rules that we implemented in Cluster 15. So for Cluster 14 and prior, these projects will continue to operate under the current allocation groups, those 4 allocation groups, until 2027. And then we'll begin the new reformed process for allocating deliverability. The deliverability allocation process for 2025 will not change. We'll continue to maintain the current allocation groups A through D. The 2025 allocation cycle, this will be the last opportunity for energy-only projects to seek an allocation, either through the PPA group or the shortlist group. And then after that, Cluster 14 and prior energy-only projects will only be able to seek deliverability allocations once they're commercially operating. Then any Cluster 14 project that receives a Group D allocation in 2025 must have a power purchase agreement in 2027 to retain the allocation. And any project that has sought an allocation through Group D will continue to be subject to those conditions that I mentioned earlier, which essentially just make sure that the project is continuing to move forward toward its stated commercial operations date. Next slide, please. The ISO is also proposing modifications to the scoring criteria that we use currently to allocate deliverability. So the scoring methodology is currently used to, and will continue to be used to prioritize projects seeking deliverability allocations within each allocation group. So for all of the projects that have a PPA and will go into that PPA allocation group, we still need a way to rank and prioritize those projects. And so we've We're mostly adhering to the process that we've used, but we've made some changes that were necessary in order to align with some of the new allocation groups that we have now, as well as some of the new site control requirements that came out of FERC Order 2023 on interconnection, which we're complying with as of 2024. So we're removing the shortlisting status, as I mentioned, because we no longer have a shortlisting allocation group, and we've changed the land acquisition categories. We've removed that because there's now a requirement that all projects entering the queue have site control. We also added a category for the status of a generator interconnection agreement, as that's relevant and a good way to tell whether a project is advancing toward commercial operations. We also added a simplified process for the commercial allocation group, and that those projects have to be scored slightly differently since we'll be assessing viability slightly different since they're already operating. Next slide, please. As a modest change to these deliverability allocation methodology proposals, we're also making one small change to the schedule. We're proposing extending the second interconnection financial security posting for certain parked Cluster 14 projects in order to give them more time to get the results of their deliverability allocation process before they have to decide whether or not to make their second posting. So we've just given them an additional 30 days, I believe. So it's now a 60-day time period for them to receive the results of the deliverability allocations and make that decision about whether or not to post security. Next slide, please. And then beginning in 2027, projects in Cluster 15 and beyond will now only have 3 opportunities to obtain deliverability. And it's sort of a 3 strikes you're out policy where we will no longer be converting projects to energy only if they do not receive deliverability. Instead, those projects will be withdrawn from the queue. I do want to note there's one sort of bonus opportunity during the cluster's facility study for a project to go out and secure a PPA. And if they have a PPA, then they would be eligible to seek deliverability early. So otherwise, a cluster's first opportunity to obtain deliverability allocations in all 3 groups would begin with the allocation cycle after the cluster's facility study. So there's sort of an early bonus opportunity for projects that can go out and negotiate a PPA. And as I mentioned, projects that are unable to obtain a PPA within their 3 opportunities will then be withdrawn from the queue. Next slide, please. So the ISO is also proposing some modifications to ensure fair treatment of energy-only projects. First, any technology additions that will be added as energy-only and can only seek deliverability once they're commercially operated through the commercial operation group. Only projects that were studied as deliverable or merchant will be eligible to seek an allocation. So if a project entered the queue in Cluster 15 as energy only, it may not seek a deliverability allocation. This is actually also a Track 2 change that we made. And then the current, as I mentioned, the current tariff makes energy only interconnection requests ineligible to seek allocations. After the 2025 deliverability allocation cycle request window closes, these new changes will take effect. Energy only power purchase agreements will also have to specify that they're for energy only power purchase agreements. So they cannot be contingent on receiving deliverability, and they can't have a resource adequacy obligation because that suggests that that project is actually seeking full capacity deliverability status or partial capacity deliverability status instead of intending to proceed as an energy only project. Next slide, please. Okay, and this brings us to the third element of this set of Track 3 reforms. And this is around long lead time resources. And when we say long lead time resources here, we're talking about long lead time generation and storage resources rather than long lead time infrastructure and reliability network upgrades. So currently, the way that we treat long lead time resources is that we have authority to give certain long lead time resources points in the interconnection request scoring process. And we have the ability to and have exercised the ability to reserve deliverability for certain long lead time generation and storage resources. So this final proposal doesn't actually change either of those treatments or either of those practices that we have. It really instead clarifies the transparent process for identifying what these long lead time resources are, where they are, and how much we're reserving through the transmission planning process and in coordination with local regulatory authorities. In this case, we're proposing that the same process can be used in the intake process to designate long lead time resources to receive points in the scoring process. Next slide, please. So the proposed process that we have, again, just to add some transparency here so that stakeholders and local regulatory authorities are very clear on what we're reserving, is that the ISO in the transmission planning process will establish standards that specify what types of resources would qualify to be eligible to reserve deliverability for. So we sort of outline the universe of possibilities for resources that can be deemed long lead time resources in the transmission planning process. And then within each recurring transmission planning process initiative, so within that currently 15-month cycle, local regulatory authorities will be able to review the standards that we provide and then come back to the ISO with a more explicit list of the qualifying resources that would be eligible to compete for any deliverability that's reserved. The ISO board approved transmission plan, which you all will see and will vote on, will then include a very specific description of the qualifying long lead time resources specific to that transmission planning cycle and to inform the future interconnection clusters. Next slide, please. The proposed deliverability requirements for long lead time resources are that they are, we're only going to be reserving deliverability that is consistent with and does not exceed the amount that's included in the local regulatory authorities resource portfolios. So if all of the LRAs identify 1,000 megawatts of a certain resource, we would not reserve any more than 1,000 megawatts of that resource. To the extent that an interconnection customer seeks additional deliverability beyond what is reserved in the portfolio, they will have to then compete for any amount that is available. So again, going back to that 1,000 megawatt example, if there's interconnection customers out there seeking 1,500 megawatts, that additional 500 megawatts would have to be sought through the normal deliverability allocation process. And then the ISO will reserve any released, will release any reserved transmission capacity if a specific resource does not materialize. So this is if a local regulatory authority either removes a resource from its resource portfolio, or if the associated transmission project that's designated for that long lead time resource is canceled. So both of these elements would come with an expectation of formal written decision through the local regulatory authority and would be considered by all of you in the ISO's transmission planning process and in our final transmission plan. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, on these Track 3 reforms, we've heard a lot of support from stakeholders on these enhancements. They've been supportive of the intra-cluster prioritization proposal, the modifications to the deliverability allocation process, and we heard appreciation for the additional transparency around the deliverability reservations going forward. Next slide, please, and I will discuss some of the concerns that we've heard as well. First, we have heard some concerns with existing ISO policy that are not necessarily kind of triggered by this set of Track 3 reforms. First, stakeholders did express concerns with the prohibition on Cluster 15 projects and forward that are energy only seeking deliverability. So as I mentioned before, we will not be allowing energy only projects in Cluster 15 and beyond to seek deliverability because they came into the interconnection process as energy only resources, which conveys that they are not interested in selling resource adequacy. This policy was adopted as part of our Track 2 reforms last year. And it was adopted in order to prevent interconnection customers from circumventing the scoring process by coming in as energy only not being scored, and then later transitioning to a deliverable project. So this is not part of the Track 3 proposal. However, we do understand that there are some concerns that we've received from stakeholders. We had the letter from CalCCA, and we have heard questions about this throughout the initiative. So we will consider potential adjustments to this in a future initiative. However, we want to make sure that any alternative to this is still preventing any circumvention of the scoring process going forward. Next slide, please. We also had stakeholders expressing concern with the current practice that we follow of reserving deliverability for long lead time generation and storage resources. As I mentioned, this is something that we currently have tariff authority to do and have been doing for the last several transmission planning cycles. So while it's not a new proposal in Track 3, we did hear suggestions from stakeholders to be more transparent about what we're reserving and where, so that there's also more clarity in the interconnection request intake process around which resources will be given points as long lead time resources, and so that other interconnection customers know what areas to have potential and what areas need to be avoided. So we are adding new transparency in this process, but we do feel that this practice is really important for us to maintain in order to continue that linkage with the resource planning portfolios from the local regulatory authorities. It's a pretty critical step for us to take to ensure that the transmission projects that you all are approving are actually delivering the resources that they're intended to as well. And then we also had some stakeholders express disappointment that the ISO did not include additional extensions or considerations for long lead time generation and storage resources. So we have committed to exploring these changes further in a future initiative as well. We know that there's a lot of additional considerations that we need to discuss with stakeholders around long lead time resources. And so we commit to doing that in the next interconnection process enhancements initiative. Next slide, please. And then finally, stakeholders expressed some concern with the target dates that were listed in the final proposal for the deliverability allocation process. In particular, the final proposal suggested a shortening of the time frame for the deadline for deliverability affidavits. It was originally posted as September 1st last fall, and then the final proposal noted that it may be moved up to August 15th, and those 2 weeks were significant. So upon further consideration, ISO staff looked into this and has clarified now in a market notice that we will now be seeking deliverability affidavits on August 29th. So we've only really shortened that time frame by about 3 days, and really only to accommodate the Labor Day holiday. So this does not constitute a significant change, but we do understand the concerns that we heard from stakeholders and tried to be responsive there. Next slide, please. So finally, we do, as I mentioned, in a couple different areas of stakeholder comment, intend to begin a new initiative to explore additional modifications to the interconnection process later this year. We have committed to revisiting certain issues that came up and were potentially unresolved in Track 2 of the last interconnection process enhancements track. So we will do that in the next initiative. We'll also review and are reviewing right now the Cluster 15 interconnection request intake results, which will provide some insight into any changes that we need to make to the process. And as I mentioned too, Track 3 did look at additional considerations for long lead time generation and storage resources that we ultimately did not move forward in the final proposal, but that we did hear a lot of suggestion that we have further discussion around. So we'll be discussing those as well. And we will try to implement any new adjustments to the interconnection request intake process before the Cluster 16 window opens in October of next year. Next slide, please. So with that, these reforms build upon the transformational changes that we need to continue to onboard generation at an unprecedented pace. We are recommending approval of these changes, which seek to facilitate timely interconnection of certain resources within the cluster, particularly Cluster 14, align with the deliverability allocation process with procurement, and add transparency to designating long lead time resources. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you all have. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. This obviously constitutes a huge amount of work, and we really appreciate all of the work you and the others who have worked on this have done. Do we go, Roger? Do we go? Sorry.
No, that's okay.
We
From
go
here,
to the public comment first.
no, first we see if there's any comments from
Okay.
the board, and then from there, we'll go to public comment.
And it looks like Mary has a.
Yeah, Mary and Joe have their hands up.
Yeah, so Daniela, I think you took care of that question that the CCAs had when you addressed the issue of the EOs in future projects. Do you feel like you did address the issue in their letter?
Yeah, CalCCA, thank you, Governor Leslie. So CalCCA asked us to commit to exploring this in the future type initiative, and we will commit to doing that. And we'll commit to looking for alternatives as well. We can't promise what those alternatives will be, but it is important that we make sure that we're not creating any incentives for interconnection customers to try to circumvent the scoring process. But I think there is probably some middle ground there that we can look at.
Okay, good. Leaving only the LSA letter, which I am slightly more confused about as it pertains to the TBD allocation reservation. It feels like they don't like it tied to the RA. What do you have a remedy for them, or do you feel like, how do you address their concerns?
So the way I read LSA's concerns was that they suggested that rather than the ISO reserving deliverability for certain resources, the procurement process sort of dictate who has access to that deliverability first. And I will caveat this to say, again, this isn't really a track 3 change that we're proposing. This is something that we've already had authority to do and feel it's important to maintain, because if the ISO doesn't actually hold back that deliverability that's in some cases tied to new transmission approvals, it's quite possible that we could build transmission intended to deliver a certain type of long lead time generation or storage resource, only to have that transmission line oversubscribed by other types of generation, such that when the transmission line finally comes online, a new transmission solution is necessary to deliver that long lead time resource that never had a chance to come in and seek deliverability.
Okay.
Okay, Joe, you have your hand up.
Yeah, my question, first of all, Dan, that was a very, very good presentation, very clear and concise. A lot of complicated issues, so nice job there. My question is related to Mary's question, in which, first, I really appreciate the clarification that ISO already has these authorities, and what you're trying to do is provide more visibility about how you exercise them. And what I want to ask is it looks like you're counting on the local regulatory authorities to look at the standards that you want to use to reserve deliverability, and then tell you, exactly which ones that are on should be on this list. Will they also in this annual process be telling you which ones come off the list, and also what are the other mechanisms by which resources that delivery is being reserved for, how do they come off that list? Because I think the idea is, as soon as they're not viable, or it's determined by the LRI it's not viable, we want to make that capacity available to other resources to develop. So I'm interested both in how you get on the list, which sounds like you've clarified with the LRI, but how do you get off the list?
Yeah, great questions, Governor Edo. So the getting on the list is a little more clear-cut right now, particularly for the Public Utilities Commission, where there's a formal process where they develop the integrated resource portfolios and the portfolios for the transmission planning process. And those portfolios do indicate long lead time resources that they think deliverability should be withheld for. So they started doing that in this last portfolio that was adopted earlier this year. For other local regulatory authorities, we are constantly improving our process of taking inputs from them and understanding their portfolios and making sure that we're planning for those portfolios. So this will be a part of that. This is, something that we'll have to build into that process that is evolving already. But the intent is to make sure that we're capturing the needs of all long lead time resources by all local regulatory authorities, as well as any changes to those portfolios. So we would expect that if they requested reservations of deliverability for a certain resource and then change their mind on those resources for whatever reason, that they communicate that very clearly and in a formal written notice to us that we would then include in our transmission plan, so that everyone is sort of working from the same information. Us, the LRAs, and the stakeholders can see that.
Right. Thank you.
Severin, you have your hand up?
I do. I have one more question on this. The slide, and I thought I understood it, that says technology additions will be energy only. When we say technology additions, are we primarily talking about batteries or storage on co-located storage?
Yeah, any technology addition to an existing project. So typically that is storage, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay, but I'm trying to figure out. Okay, so this is not intended to say, to make some, I think, unenforceable rules about where the energy that meets the deliverability requirement somebody might have provided in a PPA comes from. It's just the numerical deliverability number.
Yes, I think it's also intended to make sure that there aren't just new large amounts of capacity coming into the system and seeking deliverability without going through the interconnection process.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid the arbitrary and I think poorly thought through tax treatment that led to people having to, quote, charge their batteries from a clean resource that seemed sort of crazy to me. But it sounds like that's not the road we're going down here. Good. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions from the board or comments? Hearing none, seeing none. Next, we can go to public comment. Silas, can you check the phone lines for public comment?
If you would like to make a public comment, please press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or if you are dialed in through our phone line, you can press #2 on your telephone to enter the comment queue. We do so far have 3 hands up in our comment queue. Moving first to Jared Ferguson. Jared, you have been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jared Ferguson, supervisor for the California Public Utilities Commission Integrated Resource Planning and Modeling Team. I'd like to thank Chair Bornstein and the board for this opportunity to speak today. CPUC staff strongly support the reforms included in the ISO's Interconnection Process Enhancement Track 3 proposal. Amongst the improvements, I particularly want to note staff's endorsement of the ISO's proposed transparent process for the reservation of capacity for specified non-routine or long lead time resource types in megawatt amounts that are identified by the CPUC and other local regulatory authorities. Reserving transmission deliverability for certain resource types is critical for the state to achieve its electricity sector policy goals, particularly its ambitious goals for a carbon-free grid by 2045. The ISO's proposed process will help ensure the deliverability of resources that are needed to ensure a diverse portfolio and reliability for the system. IRP staff want to emphasize this proposed transparent process to reserve deliverability for long lead time resources is not project specific. Projects would still compete for an allocation of the deliverability under the new process for allocating deliverability, just at a time closer to their commercial operation dates and when the resources have been identified as needed in our planning efforts. I want to also note that the CPUC passed a decision this February, as Danielle mentioned, that transmitted to the ISO our 25-26 TPP portfolios. Included in that decision was an identification of specific resource types, amounts, and locations that CPUC would like to see transmission deliverability be reserved for under this proposal. We believe this sets an example for initiating the coordinated, transparent process between the ISO and local regulatory authorities to clearly identify reservation needs. These Track 3 reforms will further enhance the coordination and strategic direction established by the December 2022 Memorandum of Understanding between the CPUC, the ISO, and the California Energy Commission. And again, I would just like to reiterate the IRP staff support for the board's approval of these enhancements to the interconnection and deliverability allocation process. And we thank the ISO for and appreciate their continued collaboration on these issues, as well as their annual transmission planning process. Thank you.
Moving to the next hand up in our queue, Susan Schneider, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can please go ahead.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting, speaking for the Large Scale Solar Association. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. LSA has been a very, very active participant in all of the CAISO's interconnection process enhancements initiatives, and really appreciates the opportunity to be able to talk to you today. We are very, very strongly supportive of the intercluster prioritization initiative, and fortunately the initiative, we push very, very hard to get that into this initiative, and really, really appreciate the staff's willingness to accommodate that and to work with stakeholders to enable earlier interconnection of resources where reliability requirements will allow. So we're very, very supportive of that. As you can tell from the LSA letter, we are absolutely not supportive of the CAISO's process of reserving transmission and deliverability for certain favored types of resources. And let's be clear, we're talking about not only new transmission that might be approved for a particular purpose, but the potential is also to have reservations for transmission that was approved earlier for other resources. And these reservations are not something that only affect the TPD allocation process under the CAISO's new, under the proposal. In fact, in this proceeding or in this process, this will, and in Track 2, the reservation of transmission will prevent certain resources from even entering the queue, because the entrance into the queue will depend on available deliverability in particular locations. And then it also will affect the later allocation of deliverability to projects through the TPD allocation process. The reason you are hearing about it today, even though CAISO has claimed that the tariff has given them authority to do that, is that the CAISO earlier had been reserving transmission, in fact, but didn't tell anyone. So that's why it came up here. We do appreciate the additional transparency and really hope to see in the draft transmission plan that will come out in a few days, the first evidence of this transparency through the transmission planning process. But our position here is basically that the CAISO has approved transmission in the past for all different kinds of resource types, and in fact, that transmission is approved based on resource types and locations that are given to the CAISO by the CPUC, and in the future, I think will be other local regulatory authorities as well. And so those entities, the CPUC and others, have jurisdiction over the procurement of resources by the load serving entities that are under their jurisdiction. And they have issued many, many procurement mandates, procurement guidelines for different kinds of resources. And so that is generally how the actual allocation, the progression of resources and the allocation of deliverability has proceeded, based on the PPAs that are executed by load serving entities and those resources moving forward and obtaining TPD allocations. There was not ever an effort to segregate and balkanize the deliverability provided by new resources and reserving it and holding back for specific resource types. So we do not see the reason for that under the CAISO's new structure here. The project can that obtains deliverability cannot hold on to it unless it has an executed PPA. There's a very, very close tie and closer going forward between those two events. So if a bunch of storage and solar resources that are not part of the favored resource types happen to get a TP to allocation, they'll simply not be able to retain it. And that deliverability will be available later when other resource types that are longer lead time come into play. And we're seeing now potential reservations for things like offshore, not only offshore wind, but out of state wind and onshore wind and long duration storage and pump storage and geothermal, all kinds of resources like that. And in the balkanization of the deliverability process, we think will impede the development of economic resources that will be needed to meet reliability in the future. So that's our position. We do not see the need for this, and we see the expansion of this balkanization and reservation system as discriminatory. Mr. Mainzer referenced treating all resources impartially. We do not feel that this is true. We do not feel it is consistent with open access principles, and it will impede the natural evolution of the market. It's not the ISO's job to determine who signs PPAs and who doesn't, and effectively through this reservation system, that is what will occur in the end. So that's our position. I would be happy to answer any questions or provide any clarifications that the board members may have.
Moving to the next hand
Neil,
up in our.
well,
oh, sorry.
do we want to hear from Neil or Danielle on this subject?
Yes, thank you. It's Neil here. I'll take the first shot, and then I'll also look to see if there are additional comments that Danielle would like to add. You know, I hear Susan's concerns, and we would agree that this is not an issue or a service that should be misused. We do, however, see it being a critical component and extension of the policy direction that we work with from the state, represented through the portfolio development process. And we do recognize that different types of resources today are mapped to different areas. They have different attributes. And we do also not expect to see a situation where even if existing transmission had been built for some other purpose that had nothing to do with generation, that that transmission capacity may already be there and now may be ideally suited for a particular policy purpose. And the CPUC or another LRA is calling out that specific policy purpose. And in those cases, Danielle, I think, did a great job outlining the kind of situation that can occur with a shorter lead time resource applying ahead of when a long lead time resource is capable of applying for interconnection, and us constantly having to revisit the requirements for the transmission that was needed for that long lead time resource. So like I said, this is not an issue for the ISO to decide when the portfolios are calling for these long lead time resources. We see this as an extension of the policy-driven framework that we have in place, and that it's necessary to allow these other types of resources to move forward given the rest of the structure of our interconnection process. Danielle, I don't know if there's anything if you'd care to add.
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay, why don't we go to the third comment?
Okay, we have two more hands up in our queue. Moving first to Avery. Avery, you have been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Avery Lajeunesse, representing American Clean Power California. ACP California represents companies who develop, own, and operate utility-scale solar, storage, land-based wind, offshore wind, enhanced geothermal, conventional geothermal, and transmission assets to power a clean and renewable economy for California and the West. ACP California greatly appreciates the work of the CAISO team to bring forward the IKE Track 3 proposal, which aims to make improvements to the transmission plan deliverability allocation approach and to provide other improvements to allow resources to interconnect in a more timely fashion. We appreciate CAISO working collaboratively with stakeholders, including by incorporating the conditional deliverability allocation group into this proposal, providing a path we think will be more feasible to implement. While there will undoubtedly be areas that need to continue to be refined as we all work through the significant changes to the interconnection process that have taken place over the last year, this proposal provides a good foundation and we support its approval today. We are confident that the CAISO's team will continue to work with stakeholders on refinements and enhancements in a future initiative. One of the areas we are looking forward to addressing is the concept that the CAISO put forward to allow long lead time resources with unique development timelines to defer their chance to receive TPD. We appreciate the work CAISO has put into considering and providing a transparent process for LLT resources already, and look forward to working on more concrete proposals for these resources in the next round of the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Avery.
The final comment in our queue, Elizabeth Lopez, you have been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Licha Lopez from PG&E. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm a manager for the CAISO FERC Regulatory Relations at Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E. On behalf of PG&E, we thank the CAISO board and the ISO leadership for the opportunity to speak today and provide this very, very high-level support comment to the Track 3. We, PG&E, we were very active during all these discussions and specifically during this Track 3 process. And we appreciate CAISO's engagement and we appreciate all the discussions that we have. We do support this Track 3. We support the efforts to make the queue more manageable and simplify the transmission planning deliverability allocation process. And we look forward to the CAISO report of the Cluster 15 process in June. And we look forward to continuing the work with the CAISO in refinements, planning, procurement, and the whole interconnection process. Thank you very much.
There are no further comments in the queue at this time.
Thank you, Silas. Any more comments from the board before we go to the motion? Okay, hearing seeing none. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves the proposed Track 3 interconnection process enhancements as described in the memorandum dated March 19, 2025. And move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy, but contain discrete revisions to incorporate commission guidance and any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. Have a motion, please.
Moved.
Second.
Vote, Governor Bornstein,
Aye.
Governor Edo,
Aye.
Governor Galitova,
Aye.
Governor Leslie,
Aye.
and Governor Shore.
Aye.
Thank you, governors. The motion passes. Back to you, Chair Bornstein, for our last item, the last two.
So I think we're up to informational reports, aren't we?
Yes.
And requests to, if there are any questions about the information reports we have received.
Right. And Jen, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I this isn't on the informational reports. I apologize. I should have said this on the last time. I just want to thank the commenters and all the time that's been put into this initiative. To me, this is a very logical next step in the process. While I understand it can be controversial and difficult, and we're dealing with uncertainty, nonetheless, I think that the staff continues to demonstrate that they are doing their best to listen to people as we go along and to continue to be open to suggestions and to continue to improve where we're going. So I did want to say thank you to all of the people that participated and made comments today. And we do hear you, even if we were a little quiet there on the vote. Thank you.
And I will just add that I want to really thank Neil, Danielle, and their team. This is, and I now that I've dug into it a bit, I understand how complex this all is, and some of these nuances that really matter, I understand, to stakeholders, but take a while to get a real hold on. Seeing no further comments. Am I up to adjournment, Roger?
I think so. We can also just check if there's, I guess it's not on the list here, but if there's any suggestions for future agenda items, one of our check boxes on that. So if there's any comments on the informational reports or questions or anything for future agenda items, otherwise we can adjourn.
Can I have a point of clarification? Are we convening?
Reconvening at 2 o'clock, but it's a different Zoom link.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your participation.